Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. I am Larry Swikart, co-author of Patriots History of the United States with Michael Allen. My hair is goofy. What happened here? I don't know. What happened here? There. Anyway, and this is the lesson, Patriots History of the United States. I'm reading through the book. This is the 15th anniversary edition. If you have a much earlier copy, say before the 10th, some of the headers won't line up. None of the pages will line up. So you have to find it really by topic. But we are in chapter, what is this chapter? 8? I think it's chapter 8. The house dividing. Let's see. Yep, chapter 8, a house dividing. And the topic is defending the indefensible. And we've been looking at slavery for a while here because it really fits in this particular chapter. And if you'll recall, just to review a little bit, because we've been over a lot of stuff. First of all, we found that slavery was profitable, that you could make some money off slavery. You have to be a pretty darn bad businessman not to make money with slave labor, right? I mean, if you got free labor and you can't make money, you need to do something else. We also saw, however, that manufacturing in the South paid 2 to 4 times more than slavery. So why didn't they move to manufacturing? And the answer was, first of all, they weren't used to it. It was something foreign to them. They knew plantations. Second of all, power and racism, that the masters had control over other people with slavery that they would not have in a factory. And then we looked at some of the defenders of slavery, particularly John C. Calhoun and George Fitzhugh, who described slavery as the epitome of communism. And he said that the factory workers in the North are enslaved, they just don't know it. But in the South, they're so much better off because we make all our decisions for our slaves, is the way he put it. Slaves don't have to worry about tough choices, as though that's a problem. So then we moved on to defending the indefensible. And between 1800 and 1840, the overall accepted view of slavery in the South moved steadily from the necessary evil, which is the way the founders viewed it, people like Jefferson, Washington, Madison. It's bad, it's horrible, we hate it, but right now we don't see how we can get rid of it. That view to a positive good, that slavery is good because we take care of the slaves and they'd be lost without slavery. So that's where we are on page 276, and I'm in the very last sentence here. Equally ironic was the way in which Fitzhugh stood the North's free labor argument on its head. Lincoln and other Northerners maintained that laborers must be free to contract with anyone for their work. Free labor meant the freedom to negotiate with an employer. Fitzhugh, however, arguing that all contract labor is essentially unfree, which is a lie, called factory work slave labor. In an astounding inversion, he then maintained that since slaves were free from all decisions, they were the true free laborers. Thus, Northern wage labor, in his view, was slave labor, whereas actual slave labor was free labor. Do you see how liberals do this? This is typical communism. War is peace, love is hate, truth is a lie, whatever. They just simply stand truth on its head and act like it's okay, we just lied, that's all right, accept it. Aside from Fitzhugh's more exotic defenses of slavery, religion and the law offered the two best protections available to Southerners to perpetuate human bondage. Both the Protestant churches and the Roman Catholic Church, which had a relatively minor influence in the South except for Missouri and Louisiana, permitted or enthusiastically embraced slavery as a means to convert heathen Africans And in 1822, the South Carolina Baptist Association published the first defense of slavery that saw it as a positive good by biblical standards. By the mid-1800s, many Protestant leaders had come to see slavery as the only hope of salvation for Africans, thus creating the ultimate rationalization. Dr. Samuel A. Cartwright of New Orleans reflected this view when he wrote in 1852, "It was impossible to, quote, Christianize the Negro without the intervention of slavery." So now they've made a reason for enslaving people is, well, you got to enslave them in order to Christianize them. And since Christianity is based entirely on free will, gee, isn't that important? You're going to be making decisions for people saying they are incapable of making their own decisions, which would mean de facto they would be incapable of embracing Christianity, right? Such a defense of human bondage presented a massive dilemma, not only to the church, but also to all practicing Christians, and indeed all Southerners. If slavery was for the purpose of Christianizing the heathen, why were there so few efforts made to evangelize blacks, and more important, to encourage them to read the Bible? Remember, it was illegal to teach slaves to read. But it comes down to this again, that if slaves don't have free will, then they can't possibly embrace Christianity, which requires free will. Still more important, why were slaves who converted not automatically freed on grounds that having become, quote, new creatures in Christ, they were now equals? To say the least, these were uncomfortable questions that most clergy and lay alike in Dixie avoided entirely. Ironically, many of the anti-slavery societies got their start in the South, where the first three periodicals to challenge slavery appeared, although all three soon moved to the Free States or Maryland. Not surprisingly, after the Nat Turner Rebellion in August 1831, which left 57 whites brutally murdered, many Southern churches abandoned their view that slavery was a necessary evil and accepted the desirability of slavery as a means of social control. Turner's was not the first act of resistance to slavery. Colonial precedents included the Charleston Plot, and in 1807, 2 shiploads of slaves starved themselves to death rather than submit to the auction block. In 1822, a South Carolina court condemned Denmark Vesey to the gallows for, it claimed, leading an uprising. Vesey, a slave who'd won a lottery and purchased his freedom with the winnings, established an African Methodist church in Charleston, which had 3,000 members. Although it was taken as gospel for more than a century that Vesey actually led a rebellion, historian Michael Johnson, obtaining the original court records, has recently cast doubt on whether any slave revolt occurred at all, let alone one led by Vesey. Johnson argues that the court, using testimony from a few slaves obtained through torture or coercion, framed Vesey and many others. Ultimately, he and 35, quote, conspirators were hanged, but the rebellion may well have been a creation of the courts. In addition to the Vesey and Nat Turner uprisings, slave runaways were becoming more common, as demonstrated by the thousands who escaped and thousands more who were hunted down and maimed or killed. Nat Turner, however, threw a different scare into Southerners because he claimed as the inspiration for his actions the prompting of the Holy Spirit. Quote, a sign appearing in the heavens, he told Thomas Gray, would indicate the proper time to, quote, fight against the serpent. The episode brought Virginia to a turning point, emancipation or complete repression, and it chose the latter. All meetings of free blacks or mulattoes were prohibited, even under the pretense or pretext of attending a religious meeting. Anne Arundel County, Maryland, enacted a resolution requiring vigilante committees to visit the houses of every free black, quote, regularly, unquote, for, quote, prompt correction of misconduct, or in other words, to intimidate them into staying indoors. The message of the Vesey Turner rebellions was clear to whites. Blacks had to be kept from Christianity and Christianity from blacks, unless a new variant of Christianity could be concocted that explained black slavery in terms of, quote, the curse of Ham or some other misreading of scripture. If religion constituted one pillar of pro-slavery enforcement, the law constituted another. Historian David Grimstead, examining riots in the antebellum period, found that by 1835, the civic disturbances had taken on a distinctly racial flavor. Nearly half of all riots in 1835 were slave or racially related, but those in the South uniquely had overtones of mob violence supported or at the very least tolerated by the legal authorities. Censorship of mails and newspapers from infringements on free speech all gradually laid the groundwork for the South to become a police state. Meanwhile, controversies over free speech and the right of assembly gave the abolitionists the issue with which they would ultimately went mainstream, with the problem of white rights affected by the culture and the practice of slave mastery. By addressing white rights to free speech instead of black rights, abolitionists sanitized their views, which in many cases lay so outside the accepted norms that to fully publicize them would risk ridicule and dismissal. I'm talking about people like William Lloyd Garrison and the Grimke sisters and a lot of the quasi-socialist, fringe, almost nutball people. This had the effect of putting them on the right side of history, though. The free love and communitarian movement's association with anti-slavery was unfortunate and served to discredit many of the genuine Christian reformers who had stood in the vanguard of the abolition movement. No person provided a better target for Southern polemicists than William Lloyd Garrison. A meddler in the truest sense of the word, Garrison badgered his colleagues who smoked, drank, or indulged in any habit which he did not approve. Abandoned by his father at age 3, Garrison spent his early life in extreme poverty. Forced to sell molasses on the street and deliver wood, Garrison was steeped in insecurity. He received little education until he apprenticed with a printer before striking out on his own. The venture failed. Undeterred, it's shocking, isn't it, how many of these do-gooders fail when they actually try to go into business? It's because they have not internalized that essence of capitalism, which is to succeed in capitalism, you must first serve others. And they don't want to do that. They want to serve themselves and their ideas. Undeterred, Garrison edited The National Philanthropist, a paper devoted to the suppression of intemperance and kindred vices. Provided a soapbox, Garrison proceeded to attack gambling, lotteries, Sabbath violations, and war. Garrison suddenly saw himself a celebrity, telling others his name, quote, would be known to the world. In his paper, Genius of Universal Emancipation, Garrison criticized a merchant involved in the slave trade who had Garrison thrown into prison for libel. That fed his martyr complex even more. Once released, Garrison co-founded an abolitionist paper, The Liberator, where he expressed his hatred of slavery and of society that permitted it, even under the Constitution, in a cascade of violent language calling Southern congressmen thieves and robbers, unquote. Abolitionism brought Garrison into contact with other reformers, including Susan B. Anthony, the Grimke sisters, Frederick Douglass, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Each had an agenda, to be sure, but all agreed on abolition as a starting point. Garrison and Douglass eventually split over whether the Constitution should be used as a tool to eliminate slavery. Douglass answered in the affirmative. Garrison, having burned a copy of the Constitution, obviously answered in the negative. So let me just briefly review this development in Southern religion that involves this curse of Ham. So in the Bible, I think it's in Genesis, the 3 sons of Noah were Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And one night, Noah was drunk and passed out, naked. And it's recorded that Ham came in and saw him. Now, the Hebrew interpretation of the word saw there is not just looked and, didn't mean to see that. It's looked on with lust, and it even involves a form of touching. So this is very likely the origins of homosexuality in the world. And the Hebrew indicates that Ham did more than just look. So he tells his brothers about it, and they go in backwards and pull a bearskin or something over Noah to cover him up. When Noah comes out of his drunken stupor and he finds out what happened, he curses Ham. And so this is called the curse of Ham. Now, nobody knows what that curse involved. But earlier, you had Cain and Abel. And Cain had killed Abel over differences of how you make a sacrifice to God. Abel made a meat sacrifice, a flesh sacrifice, and Cain gave a vegetable sacrifice. And kind of the Bible's first injunction against vegetarianism. I'm just kidding. Don't get bent out of shape. So anyway, the God pronounced a mark of Cain on Cain and said, "You will be your brother's servant from here on out." Well, the ministers in the South in the early 1800s took those two instances and conflated them to say that black skin was the mark of Cain and slavery was the curse of Ham. So blacks were intended to be slaves, and they are known to be slaves by the fact that they are black. That was literally taught in Southern churches. It's just a horrible misuse of the Bible. There's no indication anywhere that Ham was cursed with black skin or that that's what that meant. It did say that Cain was to be a servant to his brothers, but there was no mark given to Cain that would indicate his skin color had anything to do with this. So they began teaching this in Southern churches, and many Southerners couldn't stomach this. They said, that's not right, that's not biblical. And they split, and there was a major split in the Baptists, with the Southern Baptist Association kind of cleaving to this notion, and the American Baptists, mostly in the North, to the, I would argue, correct view of what all this stuff meant. So here's where it really gets dicey. You have to understand that everything that affects slaves in some way, sooner or later, is going to affect free whites. And we see that if you're going to prohibit blacks from reading the Bible because it's dangerous, well, pretty soon you're going to infringe upon free speech rights for whites, such as abolitionist tracts or anything that argued against this Cain-Abel interpretation was not permitted. It was banned by law. You had censorship over slavery. Censorship of who? Well, not the blacks. They couldn't read in the first place. It's over whites. Whites were being denied civil rights due to their support of abolition. Okay, to the point that editors were harassed and driven out of business if they opposed slavery. The males were censored. This is one reason, just one of many, why it didn't matter what Lincoln said when he was elected, that he would not interfere with slavery. The Southerners knew de facto, just by who he was, he would interfere with slavery because he would appoint postmasters in the South who would not enforce censorship bans. He would appoint customs officials who would not keep free blacks on ships when they were in port. He would appoint U.S. marshals who would not participate or organize slave posses to track down runaways. And he would appoint federal judges who would rule possibly in favor of freedom suits by blacks. In short, Lincoln, whether he said he would not touch slavery where it now existed or not, by virtue of being president, he couldn't help it because the very people are policy. Personnel is policy, right? We found that with President Trump. He appointed a lot of people who were not ready for the battle. Let's say people like Jeff Sessions. They just curled up into a fetal ball and let things happen. So who you appoint determines what your policy is. And Lincoln, just by appointing anti-slavery people to many of these positions, was going on offense against slavery. So it's important to understand that you can't just contain the battle to slavery itself. It always expands to the rights of all people, free whites and free blacks. They're going to have their civil liberties infringed because a tyrannical society, a police state, which is what the South was. It didn't look like Nazi Germany. It didn't have people going on to whites' doors, knocking on their door, anything like that. But overall, it was a state in which you could mobilize the power of a state government or a county to track down runaway slaves, and you as a white person had no choice but to serve in these posses. It was a form of a constant draft, conscription, okay? So just keep in mind as we go on that there's no way you could just possibly segregate slavery and say, well, yeah, but that only affected slaves. No, it always affected everybody. All right, everybody, that's it for today. Check out my Patriot's History of Globalism. It will be out in 1 week, on 20th, roughly a week. On the 20th, make sure that you look at the video for the Wild World of History and buy Larry a coffee. If you like the video, we're going to turn this into a movie. It's not a question of if, but when. We're very close to being able to do the pilot right now, so help us out. And I'll see you guys back here on Wednesday.